Hey everyone, I am Noctis Corvus, call me Noctis. This week has been an interesting one to kind of determine what we're doing here. Yet, we are here either way, so it sort of means I worked it out, and I can touch on the bits relevant to all of this later. For now, all of this sort of means that we are continuing on from last week, in a very loose sense of that term as well. Mainly in the manner that we are continuing to sort of work on backgrounds exclusively, and different environments like I did last week. So this week is a sort of stem of that idea, yet simultaneously it is its own thing, and you don't need to have seen last week's video to understand this one. This week is its own video and its own drawing, only the ideas carry over from last week. Today we are continuing to develop a new environment. One with interesting influences, I feel, and yet some that I'm not really certain where they came from themselves. Yet on that note, let's get straight into it today, since it all ended up being a shorter video for me anyway to work on, so we really have no time to waste here. I usually start off with my influences of the piece, and today that is one of the shorter sections, so it seems like it should be a good place to begin today. After all, I will touch on it when I cover the process, but there were fewer influences that I used in this. And by fewer, I mean there's only really two that comes to mind. The first real influence I had, and the inspiration I took, was wanting to draw something that almost looked as if it had been floating. Now, I originally considered drawing a whole floating island from a distance, and that was one of my earliest sketches. Yet I then chose to zoom in a little and use it as a subtle tie, since I didn't feel inspired for the further away ones. Not this week at least. The floating island is something I will revisit. I absolutely love the idea of them and have always been interested in them. Yet, this time, I also tied in ideas from another sketch and other drawings I have done before. After all, before this, there could have been a drawing of a figure looking off a cliff or ledge of some kind, which I have explored before in many different ways and in many different senses, yet it's always been a fun thing for me to revisit. And this drawing ended up taking parts of it. Only a few parts, so it is very loose to call an influence, but it drew closer in the composition, so that the floating is more subtly implied than in your face. And it is also done so that in this manner the floating aspect can be missed as well. It's there subtly, but subtly is the way I preferred it this time. And as for the influences, for the actual focal points, like the stone and such, there is a stone near to where I live that stood like this, and I've always wondered why it's there, since it also is surrounded by trees behind it on one side, yet the other is open to the main road. So, when doodling, I decided to include the shape of the stone and the trees. From there I entirely made up the details. I sort of trialled different lines and seeing what I liked and what I didn't. I then by chance ended up with this almost sort of face in the stone, which I liked too much to change. It made me smile and it was a nice little detail, so I could keep it. But that really summarises my total influences for this week. They are shorter than normal, as this drawing was mostly seeing what happened as I went, and sort of seeing what would work and what may not, and what stuck and what didn't. That then brings us into the actual process itself this time, since I kept a little bit of a better track of stuff this week, and what I would be doing and what I would be trying, specifically so that I could talk about it here. The entire process began as I had been thumbnailing little ideas here and there. This is something I do fairly often, especially if I'm stuck for different ideas or have too many and need to narrow things down. But this time, I'd been doing it as a bit of fun and to pass time, as I had a range of things I've wanted to draw, of varying strengths and varying ideas. This method lets me sort of see which ones I like best, or which ones are stronger options at a glance so that I can sort of tweak areas of other ideas before committing to one. It also lets me see at a glance which areas of ideas I need to change and alter. It's a process I sometimes do digitally, and sometimes I do it in a sketchbook. Yet, universally, it is one I tend to not record or to show people. I'll sometimes show my art friend whenever we're discussing related topics, but that is really about it, since they tend to be messy and hard to understand if you're not me. This time, I felt that I could include a short moment of it, where I took the sketch and set it up fully on the canvas. I did know the video would be shorter and sort of knew that I could afford to show this section of this time. So I did. Otherwise, I think the thumbnails can be interesting to look at, as they range in levels of detail and different things that could be included. For example, I know that this image would be a simple environment, as I wanted to try doing something a little different. Yet, I know that there is a sketch from this collection that would be counted as a very rough sketch. It's one that I will then refine before going into the colours of it and the actual details. That one may end up as a video in the future though, since it also ties into other things I work on behind the scenes, and is something I enjoy drawing every now and then. Though more on that if it ends up a video. But that is also the joy of this process and these little ideas. I usually end up with one or two I would want to take forward and look at developing further, or at a later date, or immediately. This was a shorter session of it, since most have been done in my sketchbook already and recently, and yet it gave me two different, entirely different, ideas that would be fun to do. One which is this one, which is purely an environment where I have no want for a character to be placed in it. And then I also have a second idea that has potential for a character once I come to draw it and look at how I would include them. Though there is already an idea for how I would include them in it, so they kind of differ in that respect. But for this piece, I took to it immediately, since I sort of knew what I would want to do with it. The first step of this process had been the basic colours once more and to block everything in, if we ignored the first attempt at a cloud I tried. We won't ignore that attempt though, since it is something I should explain. I don't really know how to do detailed and fluffy clouds on my drawing tablet. Painting? Sure, I can get there eventually and do it. But in this medium, it is something I'm still kind of piecing together and trying to translate. So before doing the flats, I wanted to experiment with the different ways that I could approach it. Safe to say though that it didn't go to plan, and I quickly returned to my usual way of blocking everything in, taking note from last week's whilst I was at it. The cloud had also been a colour palette test. I originally considered making it misty and almost ominous in terms of the environment, using a range of blues and purples and greys to achieve such a thing. Yet, I did that last week, and this week wanted something new. It is rare that I then do this, brighter and natural palette, so felt that it was better fitting for it. I'd also given myself a challenge to block things in using the actual colours they'd be, and it worked for a change. So with it all blocked in, I then moved swiftly into the various shading tricks I wanted to try. The first of these being less a technique and more a setting, since I didn't want to lock every layer when trying to shade it. For those confused by what this means, Clip Studio has an option in the layer panel where you can lock a certain layer, which means you can only edit the sections already drawn onto that layer. It's sort of like a clipping layer, if that makes any more sense than my attempt at an explanation, but without it being a separate layer. And it's also different to the option of locking the layer where you can't edit that layer anymore. I've probably just made a real mess of trying to explain that, but I hope it made somewhat sense. It is normally how I approach my shading when digital, since it lets me focus more on the tone and detail rather than keeping within the lines and shapes already established, for lacking any better terms. By not doing it in this piece, it was a little closer to drawing on paper, where such convenience isn't present. And, overall, I can say that there was a subtle difference in the two methods. The locked layer means I'm a little less concerned with going over and changing the shape of the object. Whereas this method sort of meant I was more aware when working near the edge or the side. It also meant that there are areas where the shading does go out of the shape, which I, in typical fashion, only noticed when writing this bit of the script. Don't worry though, it is something I went back and fixed, since it only took a moment off camera. Those sort of fixes are also part of the process in these cases, I suppose. Now, of the two methods, which do I think would be better going forward? That answer is a little bit more complicated, since I may have to simply see how it ends up. They both have their strengths and positive traits, and their own drawbacks as well. I think that they have their own applications, since I will likely lock the layer when working on various figures and people, or areas of complicated detail. Otherwise, for things like plants and more natural forms, the loose method may end up a bit more fitting. Now, in other terms of process, I also fixed my issue with the bushes from last week. Instead of doing it how I did there, a result which I did like in context of that piece, so won't entirely be forgetting, I tried a new approach which combines how I do them now and a new step. See, I add them right at the end, so this may not be relevant until the few final minutes. But I add the bushes via my normal gouache brush that I use for the flats too in this case. I then reduce the amount of paint and its density to add areas of shading and highlights, since it also mixes with the base tone more than a higher setting would, which is normally where I leave it if the bushes are to be in the distance or a subtle implication of leaves. This time, with them in the foreground, I push that a little further with it, zooming in and using a darker pencil to sort of draw in these rounder shapes that are meant to be leaves, mainly at the borders of two colours. Some of them are lighter, which ended up being the majority, though I do add in a few subtle darker leaves as well in the areas of the shadows. It is something small, yes, and it did add to the time of the drawing by a notable amount. Yet the outcome is certainly more than worth it in this context. The leaves aren't in your face, they don't really become noticed until looking at that area. Maybe the highlights on the added leaves are noticed first, yet the subtle shape does make it more like a bush or plant of some sort without being too much. And overall, it works with how they're in the foreground. If they happen to be further back, I may have had to make the details smaller overall or add less to the bush total. Though I don't do the same when adding the leaves to the trees. I add them with the same starting steps and do try to go in and add the leaves in a similar manner. I just experimented with a paler, more transparent kind of pencil tool first, though it didn't work. Quite simple as that, really. In the end, I added the little lines to the trees that managed to communicate a similar impression with the leaves and the light, and it ties quite well in with the clouds behind them. And that little comment brings us on to the second round of clouds. See, I could have touched on this sooner, yet the process is similar to the trees in a sense, even if I did the clouds first. So I used the watercolour brush for most of the clouds in the second try. It worked well to subtly tie in the different tones and mix the shadows into the rest of the surroundings, though it worked similarly for the lightest points. Most of that was a back and forth routine I'm not too unfamiliar with. It happens more often than not. The experiment then came with the step I took after. See, I did consider leaving them plain and sort of calling it when I had the tones set up. But I didn't. I wanted to play, and curiosity got the better of me for the best outcome. So I ended up adding the various lines and marks to the clouds that do try to follow the curve and the fluffy motion of them, whilst also adding a bit of visual interest to them and tying them into the rest of the piece. It was the same on the rocks and the stone, a step I had been enjoying so far through this piece, with the transparency also coming into play in some areas. So on the clouds, it came to complete them and tie them into the style I'd been working on for this entire piece. Overall, as we wrap up the process here, since the rest of the stuff is all things I've touched on already, I did enjoy these experiments. Sure, at the start I hadn't a clue what I wanted to try, and I had no idea where I'd end up, but I think that ended up being part of the fun, part of the entire process really. It became a way to let myself add stuff I otherwise tend to avoid, and push a colour palette I would ignore in favour of something a little more out there or a little different. And yes, it isn't the most complicated piece I've ever done, or the most detailed, but that doesn't take away from the fun and the experiments that I've had with it or the techniques I've developed with it. I have done environments with more detail, more things to look at and hidden secrets I enjoy adding. Yet this one is meant to experiment and push beyond what I would otherwise stick to. I wasn't comfortable and I didn't stay with what I knew at each turn, and it has been enjoyable. Now, okay, with the drawing section complete, I want to circle back around to it being a simple video this week and something a bit shorter. I do this now once everything has been addressed, though, since this part is less tied to the drawing and more going to be myself talking about stuff outside of it and behind the scenes. First up, the shop update I mentioned last week. For those unaware, I do have a store over on Etsy where I sell prints and other stuff. At the moment it is mainly stickers, yet I'm slowly working on expanding what it is that is on offer. I'm currently waiting for some new designs to be delivered and to begin adding them to the store. Whilst doing that, I am already working on the next set of designs that I can be working on adding for the future. Now, at the same time as waiting for this delivery, there is some stuff I make at home, such as the prints, and a product I hope to add in the next update. All of this means I've been behind the scenes and such to refine processes of making said products, and also looking at how I do the prints. I tried a new method when doing my tests of the elements, and it is an outcome I sort of prefer at the moment, and I'm considering if I extend it to the other prints that are on offer. All of this sort of means I've been looking at multiple things alongside the video this week, whilst also being off my schedule with what video I thought I would be working on here. So this drawing is something a bit easier for me mentally to work on. Now, at the same time, I needed something that I could do the audio for between construction noises. The audio is something I've been working out a little slower than other processes of making videos, I will admit that. Yet the construction in the street hardly helps, and yet is meant to be here for a fair while. So if you've heard anything in the background of this, I do apologise. I've tried my best to do most of it when they're on lunch or not actively drilling, but I'd still never know. Yet all of these sort of meant that the simpler image worked in my favour. And the simpler idea allowed me to push and play a little more, as I wasn't being precious with what was already there. And this week has still been fun. But all of that checks off the final point in my prompt list and brings us to the end of the video. Despite how much I've said about needing a simpler week, it has still been fun to work on and I have enjoyed it. I hope you lot have as well, and I hope to see you again in a later video, as I will have more updates about the designs and the shop stuff, and also more characters coming soon. All of that being said, I hope you have a wonderful day, and goodbye.